demoralizing to be in the house of the sick. He wrote letters. I saw the letters he wrote to hospitals in Israel appealing to them to change their name to Beit Refuah, a house of healing. In fact, I was very moved. I was speaking somewhere. I was at the YU book fair, the annual book fair that they have at YU, and 3 young men came over to me, and somebody had pointed me out, or they recognized me, and they told me that they worked at Camp HASC. HASC is a camp for children with issues of mental retardation and other issues. And he said, I want you to know that we no longer call it the infirmary. It's called the Beit Refuah. So I was so touched. I really, not surprisingly, really did bring tears to my eyes. But anyway, and when I heard that story from Simon Jacobson, it reminded me, my mother had told me many, many years ago that when she was growing up in New York, they had hospitals called Home for the Incurables. There were Jewish homes for the incurables. There were Catholic homes for the incurables. I was reading a biography once of Yossele Rosenblatt, the great Chazan, and he had actually performed at the Montefiore Home for the Incurables, and he got a thank you letter from Jacob Schiff. Schiff in the early 1900s was one of the really great Jewish philanthropists. He thanks Yossele for having performed there and for all the good cheer you brought to the inmates. And I thought to myself, Genug, enough already. They're in the Home for the Incurables, they have to be called inmates. But people use terms like that. The Rebbe didn't like a term like that. When he met with Israeli soldiers who had been sent to the United States in 1976, they were known in Israel as Nechei Tzahal, the handicapped of Tzahal, people who had obviously suffered grievous physical injuries. And the Rebbe said to them, they are defining you exclusively by your limitation, Nechei Tzahal. He said, but it's also a known fact that almost all people who suffer a form of handicap develop compensatory mechanisms. Blind people suddenly develop a more acute sense of hearing. It doesn't necessarily mean that they can hear better than others, but they pick up on messages. They notice things others don't notice. If you Google people who can paint without their hands, you will find beautiful paintings. I've Googled it, I've seen it, of people who paint with their feet, people who paint with their mouths. So the Rebbe said, why can't you be defined by the unusual abilities you do develop? Instead of calling you Nechei Tzahal, why don't they call you Mitsuyanei Tzahal, the excellent ones of Tzahal? And when I saw that, I remembered a memoir I had once read of a man who had lost his arms during World War II. And he was in an army rehabilitation hospital. And he remembered the day before he was released, a guy, an officer practicing what they would now call tough love said, okay, so this year when you go out tomorrow, this year you'll all be considered great heroes. By next year you'll be called disabled Army veterans. And then the third year you'll just be thought of as cripples. That was the message they were sent out with, instead of the message the Rebbe wanted to do. People ask me, did things in your life change as a result of working on a book? Because people always want that. The only appeal Chabad made to me was that I shouldn't become a Chabadnik. He said, if you want to become a Chabadnik, you can become one after the book is written. So we don't want the book having been known that it was written by a Chabadnik, because they wanted an outsider. Obviously I'm an outsider who always had close ties to Chabad. But in any case, one of the changes in my book is I stopped using a word that the Rebbe really disliked. And you can understand as a writer, it's a very important word. I no longer use the word deadline. The Rebbe did not like that word deadline. It connotes death. So I came up with an alternative, due date. Think about it. Think of the difference between deadline and due date. And you know what? It really starts to have an effect. Words that have unhappy connotations weigh us down, and we might not even realize the effect that those words are having on us. So that was yet another example. I'll tell you one other thing. I was very careful in the book to not use anonymous material. Unless there was a pressing reason for the anonymity, and there were very few, where clearly I could understand why it would be embarrassing for somebody to have their name associated with a story they told me. But that was the rare case. In general, I don't trust anonymous stories because you have no control. You don't know whether it happened and whether they're accurate. There was one anonymous story I used because I kept coming across it, probably 4 or 5 times, but nobody could attach a name to it. But it so was reminiscent of the Rebbe's approach. A man came to speak with the Rebbe, and he was a bit of a complaining sort. And, one of the things he was complaining about was that even though he had raised his son to be a religious Jew, the boy was now not religious, and how much aggravation it was causing him. And he sort of went like this, oh, you know what they say, es ist schwer zu sein ein Yid, it's hard to be a Jew. How many of you, whether in Yiddish or in English, have heard that expression?
Absolutely.
Very common expression. So the Rebbe looked at the man and he said, I'm curious, do you often use that expression? And the man said, yeah, because it is hard to be a Jew. So the Rebbe said, so why then are you surprised your son doesn't want to be a Jew? He said, why don't you start saying, es ist gut zu sein ein Yid, it's good to be a Jew, and start seeing whether it starts to yield different sort of results. So again, this was a very big factor in the use of positive language. The Rebbe also had a distinctive work ethic. He worked very hard. He, as far as could be ascertained, I know Rabbi Krinsky told me, the Rebbe, but the advice I'm going to give you now that the Rebbe had, actually you can incorporate. I don't know how many of you will, but if any of you incorporate it, it will make you a much more productive person. It's not the easiest advice in the world to incorporate, but believe me, it's worth trying, even if only for 5 minutes at a time. So the Rebbe actually never took vacations, and he worked very, very hard. And obviously you'd say, well, the Shabbat was no vacation for the Rebbe, because he would do a farbrengen, he would give, hours of talks. The only people who can ever observe Shabbat as a vacation are clergy, because it's obviously the central day for the rabbi. But anyway, the Rebbe had this very unusual work ethic, which he said he learned about from his father. In 1927 is when the Frierdiker Rebbe, when the previous Rebbe, Menachem Mendel, who was at that point engaged already to Chaim Mushka, they were still in Leningrad, and they were they had surveillance constantly from the KGB. I'm not sure at that time if it was called the KGB, but it was, the Soviet secret police. And the Rebbe was constantly being followed, he was being harassed, and they were living in Leningrad, St. Petersburg. I had occasion, I was actually in the house that he lived in. I found it when I went to Russia. Anyway, and in an hour he was going to be leaving for a trip to Moscow. This was a few months before he was arrested, and it looked like he was going to be sentenced to death, and then he got expelled. But the whole family were nervous wrecks because he was going to Moscow. Who knew what was going to happen? And Menachem Mendel, I don't want to call him the Rebbe because he wasn't the Rebbe yet. He goes in to see his future father-in-law, and he sees his father-in-law, the sixth Rebbe, sitting at his table answering correspondence. Seemed very, I wouldn't say relaxed, but he certainly didn't seem nervous. He was carrying on. And the Rebbe said, how can you do it at this point? In an hour you're going, you don't know what's going to happen there. And he gave him his explanation, which he claimed he had gotten from the fifth Rebbe, from his father. He said, listen, the most important thing a person needs to grasp is that you can never add to the amount of time in the day or the night. Time is finite. The only way we can carry out all that we need to do is to utilize whatever time we have to its full capacity. This means giving our entire focus, our full concentration on whatever we are doing at that moment. Therefore, when you are working on one task, you must regard anything you have done before and anything that you're planning to do later as totally insignificant. Wow. It's amazing how that can transform your work. Now again, I'm realistic. Try to do it for 5 minutes at a time. For 5 minutes at a time, work on something, and if another thought comes into your head, just try and keep it out. Mentally make the effort. I'm not going to think about that. Because a lot of us, we end up thinking about things that have recently happened, or things that have happened, or things we're nervous about in the future. And a lot of us find suddenly that an hour went by and we got much less accomplished than we thought we were going to get accomplished. So he tried to block out any other distracting concerns, both from the past and from the future. Another feature of the Rebbe, which I think has tremendous relevance in the United States today. The Rebbe found a way to express disagreement without being disagreeable. One thing he did was he would always search for commonalities. People who are confrontational always search for differences. That's why you sometimes find that movements, even with people who disagree with them only a little, will have worse fights, within a movement, even between people who agree on many issues. The Rebbe once got an angry letter from a rabbi about a position that he had taken. And, it was I don't know if I wouldn't say it was vituperative, but it was a very angry letter. And the Rebbe wrote the man back and he said, just remember something. There are still 612 areas on which we agree. Now, obviously, he was using the language of the Taryag, of the 613 commandments. He would always search out for those commonalities, and he did not carry grudges. The Rebbe was very unhappy at the end of his, at the end of Moshe Dayan's life. The Rebbe, and you know, it's funny, when I wrote the book, and I was approached, and Chabad said they would be open to granting me access to people that I wanted, and they granted me access. You know, Chabad, if you ever see Chabad.org, they sometimes run tapes of people's interviews about their experiences with the Rebbe. How many of you have ever seen any of them? Okay, so some of you have seen it. The terrible happens, those tapes were transcribed. So, and I was the first outside person who was given access to looking at the transcriptions, which were immensely helpful. It was a little daunting. I was presented with 10,000 single-spaced pages. Fortunately, I can skim. Thank God they weren't all in Hebrew, because I can't skim in Hebrew, because my mind has to mentally supply the vowels. But in English, I could skim. So I would usually pick up, and then, it's not like sometimes I would quote them, but very often it just led me to the people who had given the interview, and you know, and then I could do it. But now I forgot, what was the last thing I was talking about? Oh, right. So the Rebbe, so I had made known to Chabad, I said, but I did have real areas of disagreement with the Rebbe. Two were very fundamental ones. One was the Rebbe did not want any compromise on land, to the extent that he opposed the peace treaty with Egypt. I can elaborate why I disagree with it, but that was one. And the other was the Rebbe was against public demonstrations on behalf of Soviet Jewry. He thought behind the scenes things could work better. What I learned in the process of working on the book was I'm happy that there were those two approaches, because he was able to get certain things done behind the scenes, but those also worked because there were people who were demonstrating. And that was, that was a big part of my identity. I'd spent many, many years of my life in the student struggle for Soviet Jewry. But anyway, so the Rebbe was unhappy with that. But when Dayan died, the Rebbe also was cognizant of the incredible defense things. Remember, Dayan was defense minister during the Six-Day War. Dayan had led Israel in the Suez War. And you know what the Rebbe thought to do? He had a Chabadnik say Kaddish for Dayan. It was very clear when Dayan died. Dayan had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. And there was great tension, particularly with his sons. And it was clear that there was nobody was going to be saying Kaddish for him. So he had a Chabadnik say for 11 months Kaddish for Dayan at all the services. The Rebbe didn't hold grudges. One of the people I interviewed for the book, Michal Seligson, had spent 20 years compiling a 1,600-page index to all the Rebbe's talks. And he told me the Rebbe never criticized people by name. The Rebbe said, I speak about shitot, I don't speak about people. I speak about approaches, I don't speak about individuals. There was somebody on the very issue that I was talking about, on the Soviet Jewry protest movement. The Rebbe was very, very critical of somebody, but he didn't name the person. I was able to figure out who the person was for my own research, but the Rebbe never named the person. But then what I found out was, guess what? 6 months later, he was able to cooperate with that person on another venture. You know, I'm convinced, when you have, I don't want to start getting into the specifics of all the names, but when you attack people by name, you really can hurt them, and you can really antagonize them. And you can do it if you're the President of the United States, you can do it if you're a leading rabbi, and then suddenly you find that there are people you can no longer work with, even on issues where you might actually can help each other. Because human feelings tend to be very important. The Rebbe, I found, would criticize positions, but he wouldn't go after people, and then was able to reach out and work with these people on other issues. And it kept coming up. And I realized how important it is, and that's something we could also learn. If people would critique more today in America, critique positions rather than going after individuals in the way that so often is done. I spoke this morning in shul about another approach of the Rebbe, of that anything worth doing. How many of you were in shul this morning for my talk? Okay, so now I won't start repeating it again. I will summarize it very briefly. And those of you who know the answer to this question, please don't call it out. If you weren't in shul this morning, you were probably raised with the expression, anything worth doing is worth doing well. It'd be interesting if you were actually raised with worth doing now. I don't find that was common, but that was the approach of the Rebbe. Anything worth doing is worth doing now, and he would devote himself to it. And you find that that's a common feature among his shluchim. And I remember one of the wonderful blurbs that I got for the book was from Ruth Messenger. Ruth, who's very well known on the East Coast, I know she's as well known here. Ruth was the president of the borough of Manhattan. She ran for mayor against, he was a very anti-crime mayor. He was the mayor of New York during 9/11, Giuliani. She lost to Giuliani, left politics, and then took over American Jewish World Service. American Jewish World Service is a fascinating organization. It is devoted to doing acts of chesed, acts of help to non-Jews, but doing it in the name of Judaism. It's not just, as a secular organization, it does it, and she brought their budget up from like 2 million to 57 million, and she gave me an incredible blurb for the book, and she said, your book changed me in certain ways. And I said, which teaching changed you? She said, anything worth doing is worth doing now. She said, I stopped putting off phone calls that I knew I was going to have to make, and it's affected me. I still sometimes put things off because I don't have the full confidence to do it, but it had a very, very profound impact on me, and I've gotten much better at doing all of those things. So just look at a number of the areas that we've looked at in this period. The Rebbe's non-judgmental love. What he said to Rabbi Lau, when Lau said to him, I'm involved in Kiruv Rechokim, and he said to him, how do we know who's Karov? How do we know who's Rachav? How do we know who's near? How do we know who's far away? The focus on the individual. What I saw, even in the Rebbe's years of great leadership, the way he responded to my father. His desire to develop leadership and fearlessness. What he said to Rabbi Weinrib, he said, Azoy, if that's the case, tell him to consult with himself. And the wonderful advice that he gave to Jonathan Sachs. I found myself in a situation, he said, don't use that language. Say you placed yourself in a situation, and if you placed yourself in one situation, that means you can then place yourself in another situation. The Rebbe's attitude of Hatzlacha Bizman, how to utilize time in a successful way, and his advice to focus on now. Try it. I'm telling you, even if you try it for only 3 minutes or 5 minutes at a time, really try and stay focused on something, and you'll develop a greater ability to do it. And then suddenly you'll work on something for a half hour, and you'll be astonished at how much you can accomplish. How to disagree without being disagreeable. What he said to that rabbi who wrote him that angry letter, and he said, guess what, there are still, I'm sure the Rebbe did not say guess what, and he said, there are 612 areas on which we agree, and his notion that anything worth doing is worth doing now. I'll conclude with one story. I haven't told this story in a while, so I hope I don't mess it up suddenly in the middle of it. One of the people who I spoke to in working on the book was Avram Berkowitz. Avram's a man now, probably in his early 40s. When he was around 18 or 19, he was still a bacher, he wasn't married yet, and the Chabad used to send out 2 young men together as shluchim. They would go out, and he was sent to Alaska. Now at that point already, Yosef Greenberg was the Chabad rabbi in Anchorage, so they went to the outlying communities in Alaska. These were not large communities. And they were going in the Yupak territory. I think it was northwest or southwest. I don't know the geography well of Alaska. And he and this friend, they arrive there. Chabadniks are not shy. And they find that there's an Israeli who's a pilot for a domestic Alaskan airline. And it works out. He said, okay, when I know I'm going to have open seats on a plane, I'll take you. And we'll stop in a city. You'll try and find Jews. And but then you have to leave, either stay there overnight or leave with me. So he takes them to a city in northwest Alaska, and they get off, and they have a few hours. They quickly find the mayor of the city. It was a city largely comprised of Native Americans. Now, when we hear Native Americans, we think of American Indians. In Alaska, it would be people who used to be called Eskimos, but who are known as Inuits. Is Inuit the right pronunciation? Yeah. So they find the mayor, and the mayor tells them that as far as he knows, there are no Jews in the town. But he recognizes that they are religious Jews. He said the kids here will never meet religious Jews, so why don't you come to the public school and speak to the kids there? And so they go to the public school, they tell the children a little about Judaism, the kids perform an Inuit dance for them, he and his friend perform a Hasidic dance for them, and the hour is coming to an end, and he knows he has a mandate from the Rebbe, so he said, have any of you ever met a Jew? So one girl raises her hand and said, I know a Jew, and he's taken aback, and Avram, and he says to her, who do you know? She said, my mother. And her mother was in the class. Her mother was a 5th grade teacher at the school. So the session ends, he goes over to the mother with the girl, and the mother, came from what they call in Alaska the lower 48. She came from one of the American states. She had good feelings about her Jewishness, but obviously it was not an overwhelming number one concern in her life. And she had gone to Alaska, had fallen in love with an Inuit man, and was living there now. But she then turned to Berkowitz, who himself was like maybe 19 or 20, and she said to him, my daughter will probably never meet another rabbi. He wasn't even yet a rabbi, but he looked like a rabbi. She said, my daughter will probably never meet another rabbi in her life. Tell her something that can make her feel good about her Jewishness. Think about it. If that happened to you, it's a heavy responsibility. You have your one chance. And finally, he said to the girl, he told her a little about Shabbat. And he said every week for 25 hours, the Jews observe the Sabbath. And he said a little something about it. And he said, but how is the Sabbath inaugurated? It's inaugurated by women. And it starts in the Far East. And so where does it start? And the girl knew her geography. She said, well, probably Australia or New Zealand. And he said, yes, the women there light candles. And then it starts moving across Asia. And then it moves to Europe. And it moves across to Europe. And then it moves across to New York. And then to Chicago. And then to Seattle. And then to Anchorage. And he said, and then it moves down here in the Yupik territory. He said, the whole Jewish world is waiting for you. You're probably the last person to light candles, and the whole Jewish world is waiting for you. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay, do we have time for a few questions?